a devoted granddad, his two strapping sons, and grandkids galore.
The DeWilds sort of lived the American dream.
Until one DeWild discovers the only way out of this family is murder.
The hands were tied with rope, and the body had duct tape around the face.
We couldn't rule anybody in the family out.
Every time there was a break in the case, you would think, now they're gonna get the killer. But this was just a very slick criminal.
Welcome to Edgewater, Colorado, a small-town paradise just a stone's throw from Denver, with lots of open space and plenty of fresh mountain air.
The quality of life is very good here. The weather is just fantastic. You can't beat sunshine 300 days a year.
Who'd have thought this happy little suburb would become the backdrop for murder? Tucked in among Edgewater's mountain roads is the home of the DeWild family. For the close-knit DeWild clan, Saturday is Boys' Day Out. And it takes more than a little roadkill to ruin a sunny morning. Brothers Danny and David don't mind getting their hands dirty.
My dad and Dan were identical in a lot of ways. A lot of the time they had the same jobs and they did the same hobbies. They just did everything the same.
They were all very mechanically inclined. They were big into automotives. If it had an engine, they played with it.
Danny's son is living proof. The love of gears and gauges runs in the blood. Their talent for tinkering flows from a single source: their father, Don. The master mechanic taught his boys everything they know.
Don was in the mix quite a bit. He enjoyed spending time with his sons, and they likewise enjoyed spending time with him.
Don was a pretty good guy. He raised his sons right, taught them a trade, and worked hard.
With 3 mechanics in the family, it's hard to imagine anything breaking down. Danny, the older brother, is a master of intricate parts and pieces.
He had a train track running through the entire house. You should see, it's phenomenal, running from everywhere, every room in the house.
And while Danny loves toying with trains, his dad and brother prefer to work on bigger engines. On Saturday afternoons, all the DeWild men get down and dirty in Don's auto shop.
Don has a garage called Don's Toy Box, where he tinkers with cars along with his 2 boys, Danny and David.
Dave had some really nice trucks, and I know the father, he had a nice hot rod and bikes. Dan, he liked RC cars.
But the DeWild men know when it's time to set their tools down and head home. Each Saturday evening, the family joins in a feast prepared by Danny's wife, Heather.
My Aunt Heather is a good cook, always makes delicious meals. She has a really big, beautiful smile, and she's really sweet.
Heather's a loving wife and mother, but don't dare cross her.
She was very feisty and could keep her own.
She was a tough cookie, even though she was small.
Heather and Danny's big, inviting home has become a social hub for the entire family.
They had a great family life, a beautiful home. He was a hard worker. She was a doting mom. It was everything that you'd expect in a happy family.
They lived the American dream.
David has a rougher ride. Since his divorce, he's been more focused on having fun than finding the one.
Daniel and Heather were very happy and a very nice couple. David did not have what his brother had.
But he's about to plunge back into the dating pool. David's new girlfriend, 42-year-old Roseanne, makes quite the first impression.
She was older, but she was cute. You saw her, and then that was the end of it, you know what I mean?
For David and Roseanne, it's love at first sight. She's the older woman. He's her loving lad.
She's definitely a fun person. She likes to do stuff outside with motorcycles. She just got along so well with my dad.
Whatever Dave wanted to do, she was up for. I could see the appeal.
David and Roseanne seem to be in hog heaven. But before long, things will spin out of control. David introduces his lady to the family on their annual summer road trip. But the other DeWilds pay Roseanne little attention. The family's veered off course, and Danny's wife, Heather, is in no mood to schmooze.
Roseanne enters the picture. She was older than David, and no one knew a lot about her at all.
A rocky ride in a cramped RV is not helping the family get better acquainted. While Grandpa Don and David argue over directions, Heather is seething over a dark secret.
That's it.
Danny and Heather started to encounter financial problems. It was about an investment that Danny made, and the investment didn't work out. It was a slippery slope for that young family.
The stressed-out mother finally snaps.
What is the problem?
Why is Danny dragging her on an expensive vacation when he can barely make the mortgage?
That's what's wrong.
Kids have always been
And we have no money.
It was not just financial problems.
Why did we even have an RV in the first place?
It was just how they dealt with each other. They argued a lot. And with two small children, it was a big problem.
Even through all this turmoil, no one yet suspects. The whole family is headed straight for a cliff.
Heather shocks everyone
I want a divorce. I want
You got it.
by asking for the divorce.
Seems Danny and Heather's days are numbered. with custody of the kids up in the air. And Father Don, Brother David, and David's girlfriend, Roseanne, are going to feel the repercussions. Empty house. And isolation doesn't suit him. Roseanne tells Danny that for his own good, he needs some company in his empty nest.
Danny agrees to let his brother David and Roseanne move in.
They took the home that Dan had been living in and divided it in half.
But before long, the three unconventional roommates are in each other's hair. Danny starts feeling suffocated in his own home.
Why does he do that?
And things outside the home aren't much better. Quality time with the DeWild children is now being doled out at Heather's whim. Grandpa Don takes whatever he can get.
One of the things that was a point of contention was custody and visitation.
So you had all the elements for a very hostile environment.
All right, kids, time to go.
The family makes nice for the sake of the kids. But behind the fakery, resentment is simmering and will soon explode into homicidal rage. With family tension at an all-time high, older woman Roseanne gives some sage advice to dejected Danny. If he's serious about saving his marriage and spending time with his children, he'll man up and win Heather back.
Danny went to Heather's parents' home, and he had flowers and a card, and he tried to reconcile with Heather. But desperation is a lousy cologne.
Heather is unmoved by Danny's last attempt to save the marriage.
She didn't want anything to do with him, and he left the house.
It's the end of a marriage and the start of a horror story that no one in Little Edgewater, Colorado will ever forget. Saturday, July 24th. Around lunchtime, Heather and the kids swing by Danny's house.
Hey, how you guys doing?
He had insurance cards for her kids that she wanted to get.
Danny and his brother David and David's girlfriend Roseanne are there.
Heather drops the two kids off and says, I have to run some errands, and I'll be back.
Danny's thankful for the extra visitation time.
He took the kids that afternoon, and they went to a fast food restaurant.
Later that night, Heather's due to pick up the children.
Heather is supposed to return at about 6 o'clock, and she doesn't show up. So Danny calls Heather's mother and says she's not here.
Danny sends the kids off with Heather's parents and waits all night for word. But Heather never shows.
After a night of worrying that she doesn't appear, Heather's parents reported her as missing.
There was nothing in her past that would indicate that she would willfully walk away right away. We suspected that she was in some sort of trouble.
The police put out a bulletin about the description of Heather and her vehicle, and it was widely circulated.
"12 days pass with no sign of Heather, until a strange discovery.
Heather's car was found in an apartment complex parking lot.
There were no signs of any break-in or carjacking or struggle. It was just sitting there.
The car's spotless interior offers no clues as to Heather's whereabouts.
The windows were rolled down, the keys were in the glove box.
It's a huge alarm that probably Heather wasn't responsible for leaving the vehicle there. I was grateful that we found the car, but we still hadn't found Heather.
Across town, road workers on a remote highway pass are doing some digging of their own.
This was a turnout where the highway department stashes boulders and other debris that kind of come down off the mountain.
What began as a normal workday will soon take a horrifying turn.
A road worker was moving a pile of gravel up Clear Creek Canyon.
Mask his calling card? Or is the real killer someone she knew?
It was very unlikely that Heather just disappeared and coincidentally was strangled by a stranger.
Coming up, police sniff out the stench of death at the DeWild family home. There's trouble in Colorado Paradise after construction workers make a gruesome discovery.
In Edgewater, a murder is very unusual.
In any investigation, all possibilities have to be looked at and explored. You have to go where the evidence takes you. And the possibility that this had been some type of a stranger abduction and that her body was placed up there by somebody that had just randomly kidnapped her or abducted her, it was always a possibility.
Dental records quickly confirm the remains are in fact those of Heather DeWild. But how she died remains a mystery.
We had been monitoring the actual jurisdiction that the body was located in, and because obviously Heather had not been located, we stayed in very close touch and actually had representatives at the coroner's office when her body was brought in. The dental records are required by the coroner's office, and they have to do investigation just like anybody else.
Every person has a unique bite pattern and teeth, size, arrangement, etc. So a coroner will take the teeth from the body and match them to known dental records of a person.
The ultimate identification of Heather's body was made through her dental records.
The Jefferson County Coroner's Office had trouble determining the cause of death because of the decomposition of the body. There were no bullet holes, there were no knife wounds.
She had a skull fracture, but that was even debatable. One expert said that was probably a post-mortem injury caused by the front end loader. The body had ligature marks around the neck. The ligature marks did point to maybe strangulation or hanging.
While the coroner can't be sure how Heather died, detectives know exactly where to start their investigation.
We knew that she was at Danny's house. That was the last place that anyone reported seeing her. So that is the obvious and logical first place for us to start.
But everyone insists they have no idea what happened to Heather.
Danny and David and Roseanne say that Heather dropped the kids off and she left. And Danny was home, and Danny said that she goes shopping.
Estranged husband Danny doesn't seem bent out of shape. But maybe that's because Heather's death is actually good news for his bottom line.
The timing of the divorce as related to Heather's disappearance was extremely suspicious to us.
The heat is on. But Danny, an obsessive budgeter, can back up his story.
Danny provides a receipt for the fast food restaurant where he took the kids on the day that Heather disappeared.
The receipt is time-stamped 1:36 p.m. Barely an hour after Heather dropped off the kids.
And when he produced that, he had an alibi for that particular time.
It seems impossible for Danny to kill his wife, bury her, and ditch her car, all within such a narrow time frame. And with the kids there, no less. But he's not off the hook quite yet.
They asked permission to search the residence. That was granted.
What they're searching for is the smell of death.
The bloodhounds are trained in human remains.
Bloodhounds go through this entire home.
They looked through the house. They didn't find anything.
Nothing came of it. Wow, maybe he doesn't have anything to do with it.
But there's one more place to search. David DeWild's SUV. The vehicle's spotless interior belies a nasty secret.
As soon as the bloodhound climbs into David's vehicle, it starts barking like crazy.
Seems David's been carting around a dead passenger.
At that point, David is pretty well cemented as the #1 suspect.
Curiously, their prime suspect is already down at the county courthouse. But he's not here to confess. David and Roseanne are here to see a justice of the peace.
The fact that Roseanne immediately marries David after the dog hit on a scent is, if nothing else, interesting and unusual.
David and Roseanne's marriage did one thing. It assured them they'll never testify against each other.
In Colorado, a wife isn't compelled to testify against her husband.
With him marrying her, it sets the field up for bringing the detectives even in closer on David. The suspicion goes even higher for him.
But David sticks to his original story. How his SUV acquired the subtle aroma of a corpse, he has no idea.
He absolutely, emphatically says that he is not involved in anything to do with Heather's disappearance.
David said that the afternoon of the disappearance that he was at his father's garage.
David's new bride also claims the day was uneventful.
Roseanne stated that she took the children into another room and kept them occupied while Daniel and Heather discussed the insurance issues. And after she finished with the children, she went on upstairs and watched TV.
While they wait on the phone records, suspicion is all the investigators have. With no way to prove the body in David's back seat was his sister-in-law's, they're forced to cut David and Roseanne loose.
We had the evidence in David's SUV. A body had been transported in that car, but we still had no crime scene.
Where was Heather killed? If they could find the location, they could probably find forensics and probably find a killer.
Even in a small town like Edgewater, the attacker would have needed an out-of-the-way place to bind and mask the victim. And one DeWild family member owns such a dungeon. Don DeWild's auto shop, where David claims to have been the afternoon Heather disappeared.
The police wanted to search Don's garage to see if there was any sort of evidence that Heather had been there, that perhaps a murder could have been committed there.
Don DeWild was basically willing to do anything to help, but didn't want to do anything.
Don DeWild is a little hostile in regard to the investigation. Kind of a grumpy old man. The search of Don's garage turns up nothing.
Maybe the killer just did a good job cleaning up. Police now find themselves at a maddening impasse.
We had the strong circumstantial case, but there was no direct evidence. There wasn't any smoking gun.
Seems certain some member of the DeWild family did Heather in. But which one? Did husband Danny take revenge on his estranged wife for ruining the marriage? Was father-in-law Don so desperate to keep his grandkids, he used his garage as a human chop shop? Did brother-in-law David kill Heather to defend his siblings' honor? Or did Roseanne anoint herself queen of the DeWild family by taking out Heather herself? For now, no one's spilling the beans.
From my point of view, it certainly looked like the DeWilds got away with murder.
Coming up, just when it seems the case of the duct-tape divorcee will never be solved, new technology places one family member center stage. It's spring 2009, and the case of murdered mother Heather DeWild remains unsolved.
I would always pray to God to send messages to Heather for me. You know, just tell her I said hi and that I loved her.
The community consensus was that it was somebody among the DeWilds that was involved with her death and disappearance. People speculated that maybe they could get away with this crime.
Finally, browsing through reams of evidence, a cold case detective finds one stone unturned.
Back when the murder occurred, locating where a cell phone call had been made was not something that was available.
But since the time those calls were made, they had new technology, this geolocating technology for cell phones.
Police already have records on 13 calls made between suspects, David, Roseanne, and Danny DeWild, on the day Heather disappeared. Now to see where those calls originated.
It's a wonderful thing because they can actually take a cell phone and ping it from tower to tower and triangulate where someone is.
Sure enough, one family member's phone did ping a cell tower near Heather's abandoned car.
David's cell phone actually pinged at the site that Heather's car was left.
Seems in exchange for a 12-year sentence, David finally reveals the shocking details of what went down that murderous afternoon. The plot begins with husband Danny luring Heather to his home with the kids' insurance cards.
Danny asked Roseanne to take the children into another room and occupy them for a few minutes so that they could talk insurance. But he first wanted to show Heather something in the garage. When Danny took Heather to the garage, David was there, and she turned to Dan and said, "What did you want to show me out here?"
That's when Danny throws Heather down on the cement floor.
And Danny comes up behind her and hits her in the head with a mallet.
But the worst is yet to come.
They hoisted her into the rafters of the garage on a pulley system.
It takes several long minutes for her to finally suffocate.
What was really shocking is that the dad would do this while the kids were just a few feet away.
The brothers bind Heather's hands and create a duct tape mask, making it look like the work of some ritualistic killer.
Heather's body was wrapped in trash bags and placed in David DeWild's car, and he went and dumped the body.
It's quite a story, but one chapter seems to be missing. David's confession does not directly implicate his wife, Roseanne, who was watching Danny's kids when Heather was murdered.
David didn't want Roseanne caught up in it. He didn't provide any evidence at all about what Roseanne had or had not done.
Roseanne spends 8 months in prison, and then the charges were dropped against her.
Maybe she didn't even realize what was going on. But people did not speculate kindly about Roseanne.
Don DeWild was also cleared of any involvement. Heather's husband, Danny, the alleged mastermind, elects to go to trial,
My brother walks through, closes the door.
where his brother David's videotaped confession plays for a packed courtroom.
Throws her down hard.
I have a brother that's very close in age to me. I couldn't imagine being in the same situation and, testifying against him or him doing it to me. I couldn't do it.
In the end, brother David's testimony strips Danny of his will to fight.
Faced with his brother's testimony implicating him, Danny finally says, yeah, I did it.
He pleads guilty to his wife Heather's murder.
The motive was basically the money, because with the payment on that fairly large house and the child support, he thought that a divorce that was wrecking his life.
Danny's sentenced to 75 years in prison. He will be 70 years old before he's eligible for parole.
A decade on, the horror of Heather DeWild's murder still lingers in this tiny Colorado town.
On the one level of the justice system, it is definitely a success. It was hard fought and hard won.
On the night America first met Susan Smith, she stood under television lights with the face of a mother emptied out by terror. And the country did what it so often does when grief appears in a form it recognizes. It leaned closer. The cameras found her trembling mouth, her wet eyes, the fragile cadence of someone begging for the return of what should never have been taken. Behind her stood the familiar architecture of public sorrow in the South. Police statements, local churches, small-town concern, candlelit hope. The repeated assurance that two little boys were out there somewhere waiting to be found. A mother said a stranger had taken them. A black man, she claimed, had carjacked her, driven away with her son still strapped into their seats, and vanished into the dark. That single accusation traveled faster than fact. Because it fit a certain national reflex, fear accepted it. Television amplified it. Sympathy poured toward her in waves. Viewers saw not yet a liar, not yet a killer, but a young woman in anguish asking the world to help bring Michael and Alex home. For days, the country watched her the way people watch a storm from their porch. Horrified and absorbed, convinced that somewhere beyond the screen lay an ending that might still turn merciful. It is part of what makes the Susan Smith case so chilling even now that the story did not begin with the truth. It began with performance. With a false narrative powerful enough to seize the conscience of a nation, and with two children already dead while the search for them filled the airwaves. Before the confession, before the lake, before the image of the car rolling silently into black water became one of the most haunting symbols of maternal betrayal in modern America, there was the hook. A crying mother, a racial lie. A country ready to believe her, and two boys whose last moments had already vanished beneath the surface. Union, South Carolina, was the kind of place where people could still imagine they knew one another by the shape of a pickup truck passing at dusk or the voice behind a screen door. It was a mill town, a church town, a place of familiar names and inherited hardship, where private damage often lived close to public respectability. In towns like that, sorrow does not stay private for long. It travels through beauty salons, front porches, school hallways, police scanners, and prayer circles. When a local mother said a carjacker had taken her children, Union did not meet the claim with abstract curiosity. It absorbed it personally. The fear became communal. people looked harder at the roads, at unfamiliar cars, at shadows gathering along the edges of convenience store parking lots. They held their own children a little tighter. Ministers spoke of prayer. Officers widened the search. Volunteers leaned into the role small towns know best in crisis, the role of collective witness. But what no one yet understood was that the danger had not come from some faceless intruder emerging from the night. It had been seated in the driver's seat from the beginning. And that reversal, that terrible inversion at the heart of the case, is why Susan Smith's story continues to disturb in a way many crimes do not. It is not simply because 2 children died. America has known too many murdered children. It is because the person trusted most completely with their safety stood before cameras and converted their deaths into a lie carefully designed to activate the deepest anxieties of the culture around her. The hook of this case is not only homicide, it is deception so intimate and so socially strategic that even now it leaves a stain on the imagination. Susan Lee Vaughn Smith was not introduced to the nation as a monster. She arrived as a young mother from a troubled life. Someone who looked ordinary enough to disappear into the familiar visual language of American sympathy. That mattered. She was white, visibly distressed, Southern, and photogenic in the bruised, exhausted way television often mistakes for authenticity. Her account came wrapped in a racial script that the country was tragically prepared to accept. A black man had done this, she said. He had forced her from the car and driven off with her little boys still inside. It was a story built to direct attention outward, toward a threatening other, toward criminal danger imagined as male, black, and unknown. In that story, she remained the surviving mother, the witness, the one spared and left behind. The lie did not simply protect her, it weaponized public prejudice. That is one of the ugliest layers of the case, and one reason it never settled into the simpler category of family tragedy. The accusation itself caused harm. It summoned an entire cultural machinery of suspicion and fear, placing black men under an immediate shadow while the real killer stood in plain sight, wearing the costume of a grieving parent. Long before the truth surfaced, the case had already revealed something dark about American reflexes, how quickly sympathy and racial panic can intertwine, how easily the public can be guided by a narrative that confirms its old fears, how rapidly the camera turns performance into truth when the performer knows which emotional notes to strike. And Susan Smith, whether by instinct or design, struck them with unnerving effectiveness. The boys at the center of the story, Michael and Alexander, were very young, small enough that their trust in the world still flowed almost entirely through the adults closest to them. Michael was 3. Alex was 14 months old. Even writing their names feels like stepping into a room that the larger mythology of the case too often leaves behind. The world remembers Susan Smith because she made herself unforgettable. It remembers the lie because it was so poisonous and so public. But the emotional force of the case resides in the children, in the unbearable fact that their lives were bounded not by some vast impersonal catastrophe, but by a drive with their mother into the South Carolina night. Their age matters because it strips away every possible illusion of complexity. These were not rebellious teenagers, not children wandering into risk, not strangers who crossed the path of violence by chance. These were babies, really, dependent in the most complete way, strapped into car seats, unable to interpret danger until it was already closing around them. The innocence in this case is not rhetorical. It is physical. It is the weight of the child asleep in a car after dark. It is the small shape of a toddler secured into place by an adult who is supposed to keep the world out. What makes the hook so dreadful is the contrast between the softness of those details and the coldness of what followed. In the earliest days of the national coverage, the case had the terrible pull of a live nightmare. News outlets repeated Susan's plea. Missing child bulletins spread. The faces of Michael and Alex appeared on television screens and in newspapers with the unsettling brightness children always have in photos taken before disaster. Their smiles became symbols of hope first, then dread. The country wanted rescue. It wanted the kind of ending in which police find an abandoned vehicle, hear crying in the distance, pull two frightened boys into their arms, and restore order just in time for morning interviews with grateful relatives. The public imagination is built for those endings because it needs them. Without them, the world begins to look too much like what it is, a place where innocence depends on the conscience of the very people entrusted to protect it. And as the search continued, something in Susan's performance only deepened the hook. She cried, she appealed. She sat with reporters, she asked for her boys back. The dissonance between what she was saying and what she already knew gave the case a quality that is hard to name without sounding theatrical. It was not simply lying. It was occupancy. She stood inside a role that belonged morally to a bereaved and helpless mother while carrying the knowledge that no search would save them. That inner split is among the most chilling features of the story. It suggests not a single moment of terrible action followed immediately by collapse, but an ability to move through public grief while privately guarding the truth. Whether that ability came from numbness, dissociation, manipulativeness, or some unstable mixture of all three, it created the emotional architecture of the case. The nation was not just watching a tragedy, it was watching a performance built on the bodies of two dead children. That is a brutal sentence, but there is no honest, softer one. To understand why the Susan Smith case still feels radioactive, one must understand how deeply it implicated not only one woman's act, but the society that received her story. America in 1994 was already steeped in media spectacle, in the transformation of private violence into serialized public drama. Missing children cases could become national obsession almost overnight, especially when the visual ingredients aligned with the habits of television. A weeping mother, small boys with cherubic faces. A dramatic abduction story, a racial suspect vague enough to trigger fear, but specific enough to feel actionable. The case arrived at the moment when cable coverage could stretch grief into a continuous event, and when audiences were already trained to consume suffering through the ritual of repeated updates. That environment did not merely report Susan's story. It magnified it. The emotional rhythm of the coverage encouraged people to participate in hope, outrage, prayer, and suspense, all while the premise itself was poisoned at the root. This is one reason the case never fully leaves the national memory. It was not just a murder. It was a media possession. The country was manipulated into mourning through the wrong lens first. By the time the truth emerged, everyone who had believed her had to confront not only her betrayal but their own susceptibility to the narrative she had chosen. Union itself gave the story a second layer of unease. Small southern towns carry their own codes of reputation, religion, and silence. They can feel warm and intimate right up until the moment they reveal how much loneliness, shame, and concealed desperation can thrive behind that warmth. In public, the language is often that of family, church, decency, and endurance. In private, the realities may include generational trauma, emotional neglect, unstable relationships, and the sort of inward collapse that remains invisible until it erupts. Susan Smith's life before the murders would later be examined for exactly those hidden fractures. But in the opening of the story, what mattered was how completely she fit into the town's recognizable landscape. She was not some outsider passing through. She was local, known, readable within the social map of Union. That made the accusation against the supposed carjacker feel more plausible to many because it let the town preserve its moral center. Evil had come from outside, from a stranger, from elsewhere. The hook of the case depended in part on that illusion. The truth, when it came, would destroy it. Beneath the televised version of Susan's grief, there was another story already moving toward revelation. Though quietly at first, a story of contradictions, of emotional instability, of romantic rejection, of a woman whose inner life did not match the image she was presenting to the country. But that belongs more fully to the context that follows. The hook needs to hold where the public first encountered the case, in the gap between what seemed to have happened and what actually had. There's something almost archetypal about that gap. Human beings are drawn to stories where appearances mask a monstrous interior because those stories strike at one of our deepest fears. Not merely that terrible things happen, but that terrible things can stand in front of us asking for our help. Susan Smith did not disappear after the crime. She stepped into view. She asked to be believed. She turned her own children into missing children while knowing they were dead. That sequence gives the case its haunting permanence. It is not simply the act, but the aftermath. The conscious occupation of the victim's advocate role, that makes the imagination recoil. Even now, decades later, one can still feel the shock that came when the truth finally pierced the lie. The crying mother had not failed to protect her children. She had killed them. The stranger did not exist. The abduction had been a fiction calibrated to redirect blame and gather sympathy, the search parties, the police efforts, the prayers, the headlines, the tearful interviews. All had been moving around an invented center. That kind of reversal leaves a wound in public memory because it attacks trust at its source. If a mother's plea can mean its opposite, what is left stable? The setting of the crime contributes its own grim symbolism. A dark South Carolina night. A quiet road. A body of water that would eventually become synonymous with the case. Water in true crime often carries a false aura of gentleness. Lakes look still. Reservoirs reflect moonlight. They appear passive. Even beautiful. But water, when used as an instrument of murder, becomes one of the coldest elements imaginable. It does not strike in rage. It takes, closes, and keeps. In the Susan Smith case, the eventual image of the car sliding into the lake would become almost mythic in its horror. Not because it was spectacular, but because it was so silent. No public struggle, no witness stepping in. Only gravity, darkness, and the knowledge that inside the car were children too young to understand why the person they trusted most was letting the world disappear around them. That image hangs over the hook even before the details are fully told. Because the audience approaches the story already sensing that the smiling mother on television and the submerged car belong to the same night. The emotional violence of that contrast is what makes the opening so powerful. On one side, a parent pleading into microphones. On the other, two boys in the dark beneath black water. The country first knew only one side. The truth would force both images to occupy the same space. There is also the racial dimension, which cannot be treated as incidental or merely strategic. Susan's false accusation did more than buy time. It drew upon one of the oldest and most destructive American habits. The use of blackmailed criminality as a ready-made explanation for white fear. This was not some neutral fabrication. It was a lie chosen from the racial vocabulary of the country, one likely to be believed because history had prepared people to believe it. In that sense, the hook of the case implicates not only Susan Smith's personal deception, but the broader culture that made her chosen story so immediately plausible. The invented black carjacker was both imaginary and terribly real in his social effects. He summoned suspicion toward innocent black men, reinforced old racist narratives, and revealed how easily the machinery of law enforcement and media could begin turning in the wrong direction when handed the right stereotype. That ugliness sits at the core of the case. It means the opening is not simply tragic, but corrupting. The lie harmed even before the truth was known. And then there's the final reason this story hooks so deeply. Motherhood itself. Society builds enormous emotional architecture around the idea of the mother as natural protector, as primary shelter, as the final barrier between child and danger. Cases involving maternal filicide rupture something deeper than ordinary criminal expectation because they violate not just law, but symbol. When a father kills, the public is horrified, but not conceptually destabilized in quite the same way. Culture has always imagined men as capable of violence. When a mother kills, especially young children who depend on her completely, the public feels not only horror, but a kind of metaphysical vertigo. Susan Smith became infamous because she did not simply commit an unthinkable act. She also appeared afterward in the iconography of maternal innocence, asking the world to help her recover what she herself had destroyed. She inhabited both sides of the symbol at once. Mother as mourner and mother as murderer, and for a few days, the nation could not tell the difference. That is the hook in its most distilled form. A woman America saw as a victim was, in reality, the author of the loss she wept over. Two boys vanished into a story before they vanished into the truth. A lie about a black carjacker spread across televisions and police briefings while the real violence sat hidden under the face of a grieving mother. Union, South Carolina became the stage for one of the most disturbing reversals in modern American crime. A reversal so stark that it still feels, even now, like the moment a floor gives way beneath your feet. We begin here because this is where the case first seized the public imagination. Not at the lake, not at the confession room, not at the sentencing, but in the disorienting spectacle of public sympathy aimed in exactly the wrong direction. The world thought it was watching a mother begging for her children's safe return. In truth, it was watching the opening movement of one of the most notorious betrayals in American criminal history, and the darkness of that knowledge has never fully lifted. Union, South Carolina in 1994 was the kind of place where hardship did not always announce itself loudly because hardship had long ago become part of the weather. It was a small southern town shaped by mills, routine, family names, church attendance, and the quiet compression of lives lived close together. People knew one another in the way people do in places where there are only so many roads, so many schools, so many congregations, so many histories folded into the same land. But small towns can be deceptive to outsiders and sometimes to themselves. They often appear steady from a distance, wrapped in the language of community, tradition, and moral familiarity. While beneath that surface, individual lives splinter under loneliness, poverty, shame, and emotional damage too private to speak aloud. The Susan Smith case did not emerge from nowhere. It rose out of that kind of environment. An environment where appearances still mattered deeply, where reputation could hold a person upright long after their inner world had begun to collapse, and where private distress could remain hidden right up until it exploded into public horror. To understand what happened on that dark October night, one has to begin long before the lake, before the televised tears, before the invented carjacker. One has to enter the social and emotional world that shaped Susan Smith herself. Because the context of this crime is not simply that a mother killed her children. The context is that she came from a life crowded with instability, damage, longing, and a desperate hunger to be wanted, and that those forces moved through a town and a culture ready to reward performance, punish shame, and believe certain lies more quickly than others. Susan Lee Vaughn was born into a family already carrying fracture lines. Her childhood was not the kind of childhood from which simple emotional stability usually grows. The people who later tried to understand her crimes kept circling back to the same grim constellation of early influences: family dysfunction, emotional neglect, sexuality bound up with trauma, a recurring search for love that kept collapsing into humiliation, and the kind of unresolved pain that does not mature into wisdom so much as ferment into need. That does not excuse what she did. Nothing can. But the context matters because Susan Smith was not a woman whose life had been orderly until one unthinkable night broke it. Disorder had been there a long time. It had lived in the family, in the relationships around her, and eventually in the way she seems to have understood herself. Her father died by suicide when she was still young, a fact that alone can rearrange the architecture of a child's inner life. Suicide in a family is not a single event. It is an atmosphere that lingers. It can leave behind unanswered questions, guilt, confusion, anger, and the quiet formation of a belief that love is unstable and that those meant to remain can disappear abruptly. For a child, the death of a parent already tears at basic trust. A self-inflicted death tears at it differently. It introduces something chaotic and intimate at once. It tells the child, however indirectly, that despair can overwhelm the very people meant to protect the world from becoming unbearable. For Susan, that wound was followed not by a clean emotional rescue, but by further complexity. Her mother remarried, and later allegations and accounts would cast Susan's adolescence in an even darker light. Whether one frames it in clinical or moral terms, the effect of such abuse is devastating. It blurs boundaries. It distorts self-worth. It links affection, secrecy, power, and bodily violation in ways that can haunt adult relationships for years. A young girl learns not that love is safe, but that intimacy can be manipulative, confusing, and shame-filled. Again, none of this leads neatly to murder. Most people who endure trauma do not go on to kill. But when investigators, psychologists, and the public later asked what kind of emotional landscape could produce Susan Smith, they were asking about a life where early trust had been broken more than once. She did not enter adulthood with a settled sense of her own value or with a reliable model of healthy love. She entered it, by many accounts, with damage already threaded into her understanding of desire and belonging. By the time Susan became a young mother, she had already developed the outward qualities that often allow troubled people to pass through communities undetected for years. She could appear warm, appealing, vulnerable, engaging. She knew how to present herself as sympathetic. That capacity is often misunderstood as pure manipulation, as though a person consciously decides at every moment to wear a mask. Real life is usually murkier. People who have grown up in unstable environments often learn to survive through performance. They become attuned to what others want from them. They shape themselves accordingly. Charm becomes adaptive. Tears become legible currency. Affection becomes something to win, lose, and win again. Susan moved through relationships with that kind of instability surrounding her. She wanted to be loved. She wanted to be chosen. She wanted, perhaps more than anything, to feel that she occupied the center of someone's emotional world. But her life does not seem to have offered her durable structures in which that need could settle. Instead, she seems to have repeated a pattern familiar in damaged lives, searching for rescue in romance, finding only temporary intensity, and experiencing rejection not as an ordinary disappointment but as annihilation. Her marriage to David Smith was part of that unstable pattern rather than an escape from it. They were young. They had children. Their life together was marked by pressures that are common enough in many families but become far more dangerous when layered over emotional immaturity and unresolved trauma. Money was limited. Work was uneven. Arguments and separations entered the marriage. There was affection at times, perhaps genuine tenderness too, but there was also volatility, disappointment, and the gradual erosion that comes when two people cannot bear the weight of their own wounds while trying to build a household around small children. By 1994, the marriage had been badly strained. They had separated and reconciled. Trust was fragile. Susan's identity as wife and mother did not appear to steady her so much as deepen her sense of insufficiency whenever those roles failed to give her the emotional certainty she craved. Michael and Alex, meanwhile, were not abstractions in this adult struggle. They were little boys living inside its weather. That is one of the most painful elements of the context. The children were old enough to absorb tone, absence, stress, and emotional unpredictability long before they could name any of it. Homes in crisis do not need overt violence to wound children. They need only instability repeated often enough that security begins to thin. In the public imagination after the murders, Susan was often cast in stark categories: victim or villain, traumatized woman or cold manipulator. Real context resists those clean divisions. She appears to have been both deeply damaged and dangerously self-centered, both needy and capable of extraordinary deception, both genuinely distressed and capable of using distress as a tool. These traits are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often coexist. A person can feel pain acutely and still cause pain monstrously. A person can crave love desperately and still treat others, even children, as obstacles when that love seems unavailable. This is what makes the Susan Smith case so difficult to look at directly. The context does not offer a tidy monster from birth. It offers a human being shaped by damage who did not turn that damage outward in some generalized way, but inward and then downward, onto the smallest and most defenseless lives attached to her. Another crucial part of the context was her affair with Tom Findley, a wealthy local man whose presence in her life sharpened the emotional crisis that would later become central to the crime. Findley represented something Susan wanted intensely and perhaps felt she had been denied for most of her life: validation, romantic intensity, upward movement. The possibility of being chosen by someone who symbolized a more secure and desirable world. In many crimes, the affair is treated as a plot point, an affair leading to murder in the blunt logic of motive. But in this case, the affair mattered not only because Susan wanted the man. It mattered because of what his rejection appears to have done to her sense of self. By the fall of 1994, Findley had reportedly made clear that he did not want a future involving her children. He may have cared for her in some limited way, but he did not want the life that came attached to her motherhood. That fact entered Susan's emotional world like acid. For a person with a stable identity and mature moral boundaries, such a rejection would be painful. Humiliating, perhaps, but survivable. For someone whose inner life was organized around abandonment, desirability, and desperate attachment, it may have felt catastrophic. Her children, in that distorted emotional frame, were no longer just loved dependents. They could begin to look like proof of limitation. Obstacles to rescue, reminders that she could not become the version of herself she believed might finally be wanted. This is one of the hardest contextual truths in the case: motherhood, which society romanticizes as inherently transformative and selfless, had not erased Susan's hunger to be chosen as a woman apart from her children. If anything, the tension between those identities may have intensified. The context of the crime includes the broader gender culture around her as well. Susan was a young white mother in the South, and that identity came wrapped in powerful expectations. She was supposed to be nurturing, devoted, resilient, naturally aligned with her children's needs, but she was also living in a society that measured female worth relentlessly through romantic desirability, male approval, and appearance. The same culture that sentimentalized motherhood also taught women to fear being unwanted, aging, trapped, sexually unchosen, or socially diminished. Susan seems to have inhabited that contradiction in an especially dangerous form. She did not appear capable of integrating motherhood into a secure adult self. Instead, she moved between roles, wanting to be seen as devoted mother and desired woman, and collapsing when the latter seemed impossible because of the former. In this sense, the context of the case is not just personal psychology. It is also the pressure a culture places on women to derive worth from being loved by men, while simultaneously insisting that maternal love should eclipse all other desires. Most women survive that contradiction without harming anyone. Susan Smith did not. The crime emerged where those expectations collided with her own unresolved damage and emotional instability. Union's racial history must also be part of the context. Even before the false accusation itself enters center stage, the town, like much of the South, existed within old racial narratives that did not need to be spoken aloud every day to remain available when needed. White fear of black male threat was one of those narratives, deeply rooted and historically poisonous. Susan did not invent that script from nothing on the night of the murders. She drew from a cultural storehouse she knew would be legible. That means the lie she later told was not a random fabrication, but a context-dependent one. She knew, consciously or not, that claiming a black man had carjacked her and abducted her children would activate immediate belief, immediate urgency, immediate suspicion directed away from herself. The town and the wider country were already prepared to hear that story. This fact deepens the context because it shows how individual crime can exploit collective prejudice. Her deception would not have been so powerful if it had not fit the racial reflexes of her environment. That environment did not cause the murders, but it helped shape the form of her post-crime narrative before she ever spoke it publicly. Financial and social stress also pressed on the edges of her life. Small-town families with young children often carry a quiet burden of practical exhaustion, jobs that do not promise much, bills that recur with humiliating regularity, childcare demands, emotional energy drained by the sheer mechanics of staying afloat. None of these are unusual, but they become more dangerous when a person already feels trapped in her own life and begins imagining escape not as gradual change, but as dramatic removal of whatever stands in the way. There is a bleakness to this stage of Susan's life that should not be ignored. She was not living in glamour or in total destitution, but in the gray zone that produces a special kind of despair. Enough routine to feel stuck, enough frustration to feel cheated, enough longing to keep imagining another life just beyond reach. Her children, beautiful and small as they were, tied her to that reality. In healthy moral experience, that tie becomes responsibility and love. In distorted experience, it can become a source of resentment. Not because the children have done anything wrong, but because they symbolize permanence where the adult craves reinvention. By the time October 1994 arrived, Susan's interior world appears to have been narrowing. The affair had not delivered the future she wanted. Her marriage was damaged. Her emotional life remained volatile. Her children still depended on her absolutely. The gap between the life she had and the life she imagined may have begun to feel intolerable. This is where context becomes genuinely frightening. Many people suffer. Many people are rejected. Many people feel trapped. Only a few begin to reinterpret their children not as sacred obligations, but as impediments to some fantasized release. When that reinterpretation happens, it rarely announces itself to others in clear sentences. It lives in thoughts too shameful to confess, flashes of resentment followed by guilt, fantasies of disappearance, private emotional logic that becomes less and less human the longer it remains unchallenged. The Susan Smith case suggests that by the time she drove her boys into the night, she had crossed into that territory. She may still have looked like a struggling but ordinary mother to everyone around her. That is part of what makes the context so unnerving. The collapse was internal before it was visible. And finally, there is the context of image. Susan seems to have been acutely aware of how others saw her. This is not a shallow point. For some personalities, being seen is not cosmetic but existential. To be desired, pitied, forgiven, admired, or protected becomes central to survival. That helps explain why the case unfolded as it did after the murders. The false story was not only a practical cover, it also restored Susan instantly to a role she could inhabit with devastating effectiveness. The wronged, grieving, sympathetic mother, in other words. The context before the crime already contained the seed of the lie that followed it. She was someone for whom narrative mattered deeply. Someone who needed others to mirror back a version of herself she could endure when her private life became unbearable. She did not simply act violently, she also prepared, perhaps instinctively, to step into a social script that would preserve her image. The context therefore leads directly toward the hook, a damaged woman from a small southern town, shaped by early trauma, unstable attachment, romantic obsession, cultural expectations, racial scripts, and an overpowering need to be wanted. Arrived at a point where the children who trusted her most became inseparable in her mind from the life she could not escape. That is the world in which this crime took shape. It was not sudden in the deepest sense. It was the end of a long inward narrowing. One made of grief, shame, fantasy, and self-deception. Union, South Carolina did not see all of that. Not yet. The country certainly did not. What they saw at first was only the aftermath, a crying mother under bright lights. But beneath that image lay the real context of the case, a context filled with old wounds and distorted desires. quietly assembling itself into one of the most infamous acts of maternal betrayal in modern American history. If there's a cruel paradox at the center of the Susan Smith case, it is this: the most powerful statement in the story was made by people who never got the chance to speak. Michael Daniel Smith and Alexander Tyler Smith were too young to testify in any formal sense, too young to shape words around betrayal. Too young even to understand the adult storms gathering over their lives. Yet if this part of the story belongs to the victim's statement, then their statement lives in the details of who they were, how they trusted, how they depended, and how completely the world failed them in the only place it was supposed to be safest. Before they became photographs on television, before America learned their names through a lie, before the dark water and the strapped car seats turned them into symbols of innocence violated, they were simply two little boys moving through the ordinary softness of early childhood. That fact matters because true crime, at its worst, flattens children into emotional props. The murdered child becomes a face in a frame, an angelized memory, a reason for public tears. But Michael and Alex were not symbols first. They were living children with habits, temperaments, attachments, and the dense physical reality all small children have: the warm weight of a body carried half asleep from car to bed, the sudden laugh, the cling of a hand around an adult finger, the need for juice, comfort, routine, reassurance. The unquestioning assumption that the grown-ups closest to them are the walls of the world. When children this young die by violence, the crime is not only against life, it is against trust in its purest form. And that is the beginning of their statement. Michael was 3 years old enough to have begun forming a small self in the world, old enough to talk, to ask questions, to recognize routine, to know his mother's voice in the feel of car rides after dark. He was still within that early age when fear and comfort are almost entirely relational. A strange room can become bearable if the right person is there. A familiar ride can become dangerous without the child fully understanding why. Because danger at that age is not an abstract category. It is felt first through the behavior of adults. Alex, at 14 months, was even more dependent, still more creature than storyteller in his relation to the world. Living inside sensation, rhythm, physical security, the regularity of feeding, carrying, rocking, and sleep. He would have known his mother not as a moral role, but as a source of immediate reality. The sound of her, the smell of her skin, the familiarity of being lifted into place. Both boys occupied that stage of childhood when autonomy is beginning in tiny gestures, but survival remains absolute dependence. They did not choose the adults around them, did not weigh risks, did not see the private anguish in the people caring for them. Their statement is therefore inseparable from their vulnerability. They were not merely innocent in the sentimental sense, they were structurally powerless. Every safeguard they possessed was located in the conscience of the adult who drove them into the night. The public first encountered Michael and Alex as missing children, boys whose images appeared on screens while the nation prayed for rescue. There is something especially cruel about that sequence because it gave the victims a false public life before revealing their true private death. America learned to imagine them as frightened somewhere, waiting to be found. Perhaps crying in a stranger's car, perhaps held in some unknown place, perhaps still reachable if only the right clue emerged. That imagined version of their suffering was terrible enough. The reality was worse because it had already ended. By the time the country saw their faces in news reports, Michael and Alex were no longer out there in danger. They had already passed through it. That means their statement must also include the obscene gap between what the world thought it was doing for them and what could no longer be done. Search parties looked for them. Police asked questions. Viewers leaned towards their televisions, hoping some break in the case would return them alive. But the children themselves had already been abandoned to silence. They were being spoken for by the person who had destroyed them. Few things in modern crime feel as morally inverted as that. The murdered were represented to the nation by their killer. And because they were children, they had no narrative power of their own with which to resist her story. So to recover their statement is to push back against that inversion. It is to insist that before Susan Smith was a weeping figure on camera, Michael and Alex were the only true victims in the room, and everything else, every interview, every plea, every suspicion directed elsewhere, was already moving away from the truth of what had been done to them. What do very young children tell us by the fact of their lives? Mostly that they trust without calculation. A 3-year-old may protest bedtime, may cry when frightened, may cling when tired, may laugh a second later. But beneath those fluctuations is a reliance so total that adults often forget the moral enormity of it. A toddler strapped into a car seat at night does not ask whether the driver is stable enough, honest enough, loving enough, or dangerous enough. He is buckled in by someone he knows and therefore enters the journey under the shelter of assumed safety. An infant just past 1 year old does not interpret route choices or emotional tension. He inhabits whatever the adult has decided. In this sense, the victim's statement in a case like Susan Smith's is almost unbearable because it comes through dependence itself. Michael and Alex tell us, by the conditions of their age, that they entered the final drive with no defenses whatsoever. They were not led into danger by recklessness, by bad luck, by the randomness of public violence. They were taken there inside ordinary maternal authority. They did not have to be deceived in the way adults are deceived, because they had not yet developed the separateness that would make deception meaningful. They simply trusted. If there's a more devastating form of human vulnerability, it is hard to name. The details of their individual personalities, as later remembered by relatives and those who knew them, matter because they restore the density of life that murder tries to erase. Michael was often described as bright, affectionate, energetic, alive with the ordinary insistence of a preschool child whose world is still small enough to be held in routines and faces. One imagines his voice filling the house in those repetitive child questions adults sometimes brush aside without knowing how much they will later ache to hear them again. One imagines toys left on floors, cartoons half-watched, sticky hands, questions about where they were going, the mild resistance or dreamy quiet that marks the end of a child's day. Alex, still so young, would have been remembered more through gesture than language. The way he looked up, the way he reached, the softness of sleep, the particular heaviness of a 1-year-old body carried against the shoulder. These are not decorative details. They are the content of personhood at that age. When children die violently, especially at the hands of a parent, their individuality is often swallowed by the enormity of the betrayal. They become examples of innocence, which is true, but not enough. Michael and Alex were not only innocent, they were specific. Someone knew the rhythm of their breathing when they fell asleep. Someone knew which one fussed in what way. Someone knew what foods they liked, which songs held their attention, what sounds made them laugh. Those details, however ordinary, are the true counterweight to the cruelty of the case. They remind us that 2 actual little boys were present in that car. Not symbols, not abstractions, not just the children in a news story, but sons with bodies still warm from living. The fact that their mother was the one who killed them does not erase the possibility that they loved her. In fact, it intensifies the tragedy because young children almost always do. They do not love conditionally or shrewdly. They attach, they seek, they return. This is one of the hardest truths in filicide. The child's love does not protect the child. Michael and Alex likely experienced their mother as one of the defining realities of their existence. Even in a troubled home, even with adult instability moving through the atmosphere, children often continue reaching toward the parent they know. That is not evidence of a healthy bond. It is evidence of childhood itself. To consider their final hours is therefore to confront the deepest obscenity of the case. They were almost certainly with the person they would naturally have trusted most. If they were drowsy from the hour, if they were quiet in their seats, If one or both had begun slipping toward sleep, then the betrayal becomes even more harrowing. Because the victim's statement here may be nothing more and nothing less than this. They did not resist the ride because they had no reason to imagine the ride was death. They were delivered into it by the ordinary mechanics of care. When the public later learned what had really happened, many focused understandably on Susan's lie, on the false accusation against a black man, on the manipulation of sympathy. Those elements are central. But they can also pull attention away from what the boys' deaths tell us about domestic vulnerability. Michael and Alex did not die in some chaotic burst of visible rage. They died through a decision carried out in eerie stillness. There was no public frenzy, no spectacle of violence at the point of death, no overheard fight spilling into the street. Their murder was hidden inside a maternal act that outwardly resembled routine, a drive with children in the car at night. That concealment is part of their statement too. It tells us that danger to children does not always arrive in forms adults have been trained to recognize. Society teaches people to fear the stranger in the alley, the faceless predator, the public threat. It is less comfortable confronting the fact that some of the deadliest danger to children comes from within the home. From parents who can still pack snacks, buckle straps, and speak in soothing tones. The Susan Smith case forced the country to see that, at least for a moment, Michael and Alex speak through that forced recognition. They remind us that children are most endangered when the adult world insists on locating danger somewhere else. Their statement also includes the racial lie that followed. Because Susan falsely claimed a black carjacker had taken her sons, Michael and Alex were temporarily transformed into victims of an invented public crime rather than the real private one that killed them. In that way, even after death, their truth was displaced. Their bodies were used to animate a story that did not belong to them. The public grieved them under false premises. Law enforcement searched for an imaginary perpetrator. Suspicion drifted toward innocent black men who happened to fit the role Susan knew America was ready to fear. This matters profoundly because it means the boys were denied even the honesty of their own victimhood at first. Their deaths were folded into a racist fabrication before they were allowed to stand as what they were, an act of maternal murder. To center the victims is therefore to reject not only the killer's later self-presentation, but the entire false narrative imposed on the children's disappearance. Michael and Alex were not abducted from their mother. They were surrendered by her to death. That is the truth their silence demands be spoken plainly. There is also something unspeakably haunting in the likely physical experience of their final moments, though one must approach this with restraint and respect. Young children strapped into car seats are helpless in a way that adults rarely are. Their safety device, meant to protect them, becomes in such a context a terrible form of immobilization. That fact alone transforms the emotional meaning of the murder. These were not children who could open a door, run into the dark, or even fully understand what was happening soon enough to conceptualize escape. Their small bodies were fixed in place. Whatever confusion, fear, crying, or sleepiness attended those last moments, it unfolded within absolute dependence. We cannot know exactly what Michael saw, or whether Alex understood anything beyond disruption and panic. But we know enough to say that they had no avenue of agency. The adult with total control over the situation chose not rescue but annihilation. When people say the Susan Smith case is especially horrifying, this is one reason why. The murder method, quiet and controlled, did not merely end life, it exploited the trust, confinement, and voicelessness of very small children. The victim's statement is written in that exploitation. Society often romanticizes children after their deaths, surrounding them with angelic language that can accidentally remove their earthly reality. But the real moral force of Michael and Alex's lives lies in the fact that they were ordinary little boys in ordinary dependence. They had futures in the simple human sense: school mornings, scraped knees, favorite foods, illnesses, birthdays, sibling quarrels, attachment to grandparents, perhaps later resentment and forgiveness, perhaps first bicycles. school pictures, the mundane accumulation by which a person becomes more himself over time. All of that was erased before it could unfold. Murdering children does not only take what they are, it takes what they would have become. In cases involving very young victims, that theft feels almost wider than the world can process because the imagined future is so large compared with the tiny body. Michael and Alex represent that stolen horizon. Their statement is not philosophical, it is developmental. They were supposed to have more time. They were supposed to outgrow car seats and baby shoes and television photographs. They were supposed to become boys who remembered things, then boys who forgot them. Then men whose early childhood would have survived only in family stories. Instead, they remained fixed forever at 3 years and 14 months. Their whole possible lives compressed into a brief and terrible chapter of national memory. Another part of the victim's statement lies in the aftermath, in how others remembered them. Family members and mourners did what mourners always do with dead children. They reached for images of sweetness, innocence, and love because anything else feels impossible to bear. But beneath those rituals of remembrance, there is a harder truth. The boys' deaths were not only tragic, they were useful to the killer for a time. Their absence gave Susan a role to perform. Their names became the emotional engine of her appeals. Their vulnerability generated the public sympathy she then stood inside. This is one of the ugliest indignities done to them. They were not allowed immediately to be only mourned. They were instrumentalized through the story of their own disappearance. That is why writing their statement requires a kind of moral correction. The children were not supporting characters in Susan Smith's tragedy. She was the source of theirs. Michael and Alex belong at the center, and their silence should weigh more heavily than any of her tears. If there is a final truth they leave behind, it may be about the sacredness of dependence. Human civilization rests on the idea that those with power over the weak must use it for protection. Parents over children, adults over the vulnerable, caretakers over dependents. This is one of the oldest moral arrangements we have. When that arrangement is inverted, something more than a law is broken. A foundation is. The Susan Smith case horrified the nation because it exposed such an inversion in one of its starkest forms. Two little boys placed total trust in the adult who controlled their lives, and that adult chose death. Their statement, then, is also an accusation against any culture too eager to sentimentalize motherhood while ignoring how children actually survive. Not on symbols, but on the daily moral reliability of the people who care for them. Michael and Alex accuse the lie that says maternal identity alone guarantees safety. They accuse the lie that public tears necessarily reflect private innocence. They accuse the reflex that looked for a stranger while the true danger sat behind the wheel. But they also ask for something gentler and more human than accusation. They ask to be seen as children, not only victims. To imagine the softness of their lives before the night closed over them. To remember that whatever darkness consumed the adult at the center of this case, the boys themselves remained what children are at that age, trusting, unfinished, full of beginnings. That is the deepest wound in the story and the clearest statement they leave behind. They had done nothing except belong completely to someone who did not honor the belonging. They were not old enough to lie, to manipulate sympathy, to construct alibis, or to weaponize the fears of a nation. They were small enough only to believe, and in the end. That is why their silence speaks so loudly, Michael and Alex Smith tell us. Without words. What makes this case unforgivable? Not only that they died, but that they died while still held inside the most innocent form of trust human life contains. The night of October 25th, 1994 did not arrive in Union, South Carolina, with any outward sign that it would end in one of the most disturbing acts of maternal violence in modern American memory. It came the way so many southern autumn nights come, with darkness settling gradually over familiar roads, with the air cooling after the day's lingering warmth, with headlights beginning to carve thin private tunnels through stretches of blacktop bordered by trees, water, and silence in small towns. Night often feels less like an event than a folding inward. Businesses dim. Houses hold their own small lights. Cars move through the dark, carrying ordinary lives homeward. On that night, one of those cars held Susan Smith and her 2 young sons, Michael and Alex, and from the outside there would have been nothing in the shape of the scene to warn anyone what was about to happen. No public argument spilling into a parking lot, no visible struggle. No stranger emerging from shadows. The evil of what unfolded was wrapped almost entirely in routine. A mother drove with her children after dark. That sentence should belong to safety. To sleepy backseat murmurs, to little heads nodding forward in exhaustion. To the ordinary mercy of being carried home. In this case, it became the setting for betrayal so complete that even now, decades later, it retains a quality almost too cold to think about for long. The incident did not begin in chaos. It began in control. That is what makes it so hard to bear. Susan was not overtaken in some sudden storm of external violence. She moved through the evening under her own direction, with her children in their seats behind her, into a sequence of choices that would end with them trapped beneath dark water while she walked away into the night. At some point that evening, she drove toward John Day, Long Lake, a reservoir area outside Union whose stillness would later become inseparable from the case. Lakes at night possess a deceptive calm. In daylight, they can look pastoral, ordinary, almost friendly, part of the landscape's quiet background. At night, they become something else. The road narrows. The land feels emptier, sound changes, and the black surface of the water ceases to reflect life in any comforting way. It becomes depth without expression. A person arriving there at night knows, even before stepping out, that this is a place where the world can swallow evidence of human activity quickly. That knowledge hangs over the Susan Smith case because the location was not random in any innocent sense. The drive there already suggests planning or at least purposeful movement toward isolation. This was not some spontaneous turn, taken in a moment of confused wandering. A mother with 2 small children in the car traveled to a remote lakeside boat ramp after dark. Whatever storm moved inside her, it moved within deliberate geography. She reached a place where few eyes would intrude, and where the water waited close enough to do what she intended it to do. The boys were in the car seats, strapped in, contained by the very devices designed to keep them alive in traffic and daily travel. That detail has always been one of the most haunting and morally unbearable facts of the case because it transforms safety into confinement. A car seat is an emblem of care. It is what a parent uses to protect a child from impact, from sudden stops, from the unpredictability of the road. In that car on that night, the seats became instruments of helplessness. Michael, 3 years old, was old enough to speak, to ask where they were going, to understand enough of a strange detour or strange pause to feel unease if something seemed wrong. Alex, only 14 months old, would have inhabited the ride more through sensation than thought, through sound, darkness, the rhythm of the car, the presence of his mother. Neither child had any avenue of escape. Neither had any reason to imagine that the person controlling the vehicle had turned the machinery of protection against them. That is the emotional center of the incident. The children were not only overpowered, they were trusted into danger. There may have been a pause at the ramp. There may have been an interval in which the car idled or sat still, the outside darkness pressing against the windows while the ordinary interior sounds of children in a vehicle remained heartbreakingly normal. A small rustle, a question from Michael, the soft fussing or sleepy quiet of Alex, the sound of an engine in neutral or park. We do not know every second, but the mind cannot help approaching that threshold and feeling the obscene stillness of it, because whatever happened next required a crossing far more terrible than the physical line between land and water. Susan had to move from thought into act. She had to stop being merely a woman in emotional crisis and become the agent of her son's deaths. That crossing is where the incident becomes almost impossible to humanize without diminishing its horror. There are crimes of sudden rage, drunken escalation, panic, and impulse. This one had a colder shape. It required maintaining enough control to position the car, exit it, and set in motion a death that would continue after she was safe. At some point, she got out of the vehicle. That alone is one of the most devastating images in the case. A mother opens the driver's side door, steps out into the South Carolina dark, and leaves behind 2 children secured where she had put them. The night air would have touched her. The ground would have felt solid beneath her feet. The car remained behind her as an enclosed world containing her sons. It is difficult to describe that movement without feeling that language itself recoils. Every natural instinct associated with parenthood runs in the opposite direction. A parent sees danger and reaches into the car, unbuckles straps, pulls a child free, holds them close, counts them, protects them. Susan did the reverse. She separated herself from the only people in the car who could not save themselves. Then the vehicle began to move, whether released from the brake, shifted deliberately, or otherwise sent forward. The result is the same in moral terms. The car rolled down the boat ramp toward the water, carrying Michael and Alex with it. There is a dreadful slowness to the imagined motion that makes the incident feel almost mythic in its cruelty. Not a collision, not an explosion, not a burst of obvious violence, but a car quietly advancing into black water while the mother stands outside, alive, watching, or at least knowing. The descent would have been measurable in seconds, but those seconds stretch infinitely in the mind because they contain every opportunity for reversal. At any moment before the water closed in, she could have run to the car, pulled open a door, thrown herself across the seats, screamed for help, changed her mind. She did not. That is the spine of Part 4. The incident was not only the drowning of 2 children, it was the sustained refusal to interrupt a death she had initiated. Water rose around the tires first, then along the body of the car. The darkness of the lake, the angle of descent, the trapped interior space, all combined into one of the most terrifying forms of death imaginable. Especially for small children, a vehicle sinking is not an abstraction. It fills, shifts, tilts, presses sound into panic. The familiar inside of the car becomes suddenly alien. Michael may have cried out. He may have called for his mother. He may have felt the wrongness before he had words for it. Alex, younger, may have begun crying in confusion, responding to the abrupt break in ordinary rhythm, to the movement, the water, the fear in the air. We cannot know exactly what they experienced second by second. And there is dignity in refusing to turn the unknowable into spectacle, but we know enough to understand the structure of their final terror. They were alive. They were confined. Their mother was no longer rescuing them. The world inside the car was changing from shelter to tomb. The car continued into the water until it disappeared beneath the surface, taking with it the boys, the seats, the trapped air, and the final living reality of a relationship that the outside world would still for hours and days afterward. Misread entirely, once the vehicle had gone under, the lake closed over the evidence with a calmness almost more horrifying than visible violence. That is one of water's cruelest qualities in criminal acts. It restores surface peace quickly. The ripples flatten. The darkness remains. Nature resumes its silence as though nothing human has been entrusted to it. On shore, Susan was still alive, dry enough to move, capable of speech, capable of narrative. Her sons were now below her, enclosed in a sinking machine that would settle on the lakebed while the world above remained ignorant. This is where the incident extends beyond the act of killing into something still more disturbing. Because the immediate aftermath required not collapse, not confession, not self-destruction, but performance. The murders were not followed by a mother flinging herself into the water in remorse or madness. They were followed by a mother walking away from the scene and preparing to tell a story. That continuity of function is one of the most chilling features of the case. It suggests an emotional partitioning so severe that the human mind resists accepting it. Susan left the area and entered the next stage of the incident, the fabrication. She reported that a black man had carjacked her, taking the car with her children still inside. That lie did not emerge after days of reflection. It came quickly, as the immediate frame through which the nation would first encounter the disappearance, which means that almost as soon as the car went under, the murders were joined to racial deception and strategic self-presentation. The incident, then, was never only the drowning. It was also the immediate conversion of the drowning into an abduction narrative calculated to redirect suspicion and gather sympathy. In this sense, the crime unfolded in two theaters at once, the private one at the lake, where the children died, and the public one that began moments later, where Susan became the surviving witness to an invented crime. But before that public theater fully opened, there must have been the physical and emotional passage from the lake back into town, from isolation back into society. That journey may be one of the eeriest hidden stretches in the entire case. A woman has just watched or knowingly allowed her children to vanish beneath water. Now she is back among roads, lights, human voices, police. Questions. She must carry inside her the knowledge of where the boys really are while speaking of them as though they have been stolen away by another person. That movement from murder to performance happened with astonishing speed. The incident did not end when the car sank. It continued through each false word that followed, each tear that rose on command or out of some more complicated internal fracture. Each repetition of the lie that moved the country farther from the real scene at the bottom of the lake. Yet to stay faithful to this section, one must hold close to the place where it all truly happened. The boat ramp, the car, the boys in their seats, the mother outside the vehicle, the black water closing. That is the core. Everything afterward. Every plea on television, every prayer vigil, every police bulletin, every search based on the story of the fictional carjacker rests on that unseen incident. It is the hidden engine of the whole case. The public did not witness it, which is partly why the later revelation was so shattering. They had been made to imagine a different danger entirely, but the true violence was quieter than kidnapping, quieter than gunfire, quieter than a struggle by the roadside. It was the violence of abandonment enacted through patience. The mother did not need a weapon raised above her head. The lake became the weapon, the car became the chamber. The straps became the restraint, the night became concealment. And all of it was arranged through the authority a parent naturally has over children too young to protest meaningfully. There is also a terrible symbolism in the way the incident inverted familiar rituals of care. Ordinarily, a mother buckles her children into a car and drives because she intends to bring them somewhere safe or necessary. Home, daycare, a doctor's office, a grandparent's house. The act of fastening the straps is protective. The act of steering the car is responsible. The act of driving through the dark is often a gesture of devotion. A parent carrying sleeping children where they need to be. In Susan Smith's case, every one of those gestures was preserved in form and corrupted in purpose. The buckling remained. The driving remained. The nighttime ride remained. But the destination had become death. That is why the incident continues to feel so especially evil. It didn't violate care from outside. It mimicked care until the final moment, using the choreography of love as the mechanism of destruction. This is what makes maternal filicide uniquely destabilizing for the public imagination. It does not merely confront us with violence, it confronts us with violence wearing the structure of nurture. After Susan reported the false carjacking, the incident crossed fully into public life. Police responded. Questions were asked. Descriptions were given. Search efforts began. But beneath all of that activity lay the submerged reality that no search could help the boys now. The car rested underwater. Michael and Alex were gone. Their deaths had already occurred in the only place that truly mattered. And the woman speaking on their behalf knew it. That knowledge deepens the meaning of the original act because it shows that the murder was not an isolated burst of destruction followed by emotional collapse. It was compatible with continued deception. The incident included enough self-possession to inhabit the role of victim almost immediately. That does not necessarily mean Susan felt nothing. Human beings can feel panic, grief, self-pity, horror, and self-preservation all at once. But whatever she felt did not move her toward truth. It moved her toward concealment. And concealment, when joined so quickly to the deaths of one's own children, becomes part of the act itself. When people later tried to understand the case, they often focused on motive, a failed affair, a sense of entrapment, a desire for a man who did not want children, emotional instability, rejection. All of those matter, and they belong to the context. But during the incident itself, what matters most is not motive but decision. Susan Smith had multiple moments in which to do otherwise. She could have turned the car around before reaching the lake. She could have stopped at the ramp and driven away. She could have panicked at the first sight of the water and pulled her boys free. She could have confessed moments later. Instead, she continued. The incident therefore reveals not only despair but sustained volition, however fractured her mind may have been. The sequence required enough coherence to carry intention through to completion. That is one reason the case remains so difficult for many people to absorb. It resists being filed neatly under madness. The night had too much order in it. By the time the world began hearing about the abduction, the real event was already sealed under darkness and water. Union would soon fill with fear, the media with sympathy, law enforcement with urgency, but those belong to the next stages. The incident itself remains there at the lake, stripped of later noise. A mother arrives with 2 sleeping or sleepy boys. She exits the car. She lets it roll into the reservoir. She leaves them there. The water takes the vehicle and the children strapped inside it. Then she walks back into society and offers another story. There is no way to soften that sequence honestly without betraying the victims. It is simple, which is part of its horror. No complex criminal enterprise. No conspirators, no hidden assailant. Just a dark road, a remote ramp, a mother's choice, and 2 boys who could not unbuckle themselves from the person they loved. In the end, the incident of the Susan Smith case is horrifying not only because of what happened, but because of how little the world around it had to change for it to occur. The night remained quiet. The lake remained still. The town remained itself for a little while longer. Nothing in the physical setting had to become dramatic. All the drama was moral. It lived in the gap between what motherhood promises and what Susan Smith did instead. On October 25th, 1994, that gap opened beside a South Carolina lake and swallowed 2 children whole. By the time Susan Smith stepped back into the world and spoke the first words of her false story, the real crime scene was already hidden under dark South Carolina water. That fact gave the case an eerie split from the beginning. There was the public crime scene people believed they were dealing with, a roadside carjacking, an abduction, a desperate mother left behind, and there was the real one, quiet, submerged, and invisible to everyone except the person who had created it. Part 5 of this story lives inside that split. It belongs to the lake, the car, the invisible evidence lying in black water, and to the first investigators and searchers moving frantically around a narrative that had already betrayed them. It is the stage where physical clues begin to exist before they're understood, where the dead children remain out of sight but not absent, and where every early assumption points in the wrong direction because the killer has already planted a false trail. That is one reason the Susan Smith case feels so especially chilling. The crime scene did not initially appear as a place of stillness and truth. It appeared as a national emergency built on a lie. The first clues were there from the beginning, but they had to fight through sympathy, performance, and prejudice before anyone could hear what they were saying. When Susan reported that a black man had carjacked her and driven away with Michael and Alex still in the vehicle, police had little choice at first but to respond to the story presented. Time matters enormously in child abduction cases. Officers move quickly because delay can mean death. That urgency shaped the first hours. Descriptions were gathered. Routes were considered. Alerts went out. Search patterns expanded. Patrol units and investigators moved through the world of roads, intersections, gas stations, and imagined escape paths. The crime scene, in that public version of events, was mobile. It was no longer one fixed place. It was every highway out of Union, every dark shoulder, every reported sighting, every person who looked vaguely suspicious to frighten witnesses. The absence of the car made the supposed abduction feel alarmingly plausible. A mother said her children had been taken in her vehicle, and until proven otherwise, the vehicle itself became a moving unknown. That meant the most important early evidence was physically unavailable. If the car were somewhere out there, it held the boys' fingerprints, trace evidence, perhaps the actual scene of struggle, but because the car was underwater, stationary on the lakebed, the investigation began with the central object missing and the central story false. That combination distorted everything. Even so, the earliest responses to Susan carried undertones that would later matter. Investigators noticed emotional details, timing details, small inconsistencies in how she described the event. In the immediate aftermath, however, those impressions existed alongside the urgency of rescue. Susan said she had been stopped at a traffic light near the end of town. She described the man. She described the supposed weapon. She described being forced out while her sons remained strapped in their seats. That image was horrifying enough to mobilize the country. But from an investigative standpoint, it also created a scene that left surprisingly little physical evidence in the place where it supposedly happened. A real carjacking at a light might yield tire marks, witnesses, traces of struggle, a more coherent sequence of movement, some external corroboration from the surrounding environment. Instead, what authorities had at first was mostly Susan herself. She became the primary source, the victim witness through whom the entire scene had to be imagined. That reliance on her account was the first contamination, not in the forensic sense of careless handling, but in the narrative sense. The physical world had not yet spoken clearly enough to overrule her. The true crime scene, meanwhile, lay at John D. Long Lake, where the car sat beneath the surface with two boys still strapped inside. The place itself matters. Boat ramps are practical spaces, not theatrical ones. Concrete slopes into water. Tires and trailers use them. Fishermen come and go. During the day, they can feel ordinary, even dull. At night, they become unsettlingly bare. Light is limited. The transition from land to water is direct and unforgiving. Once the car went down, the ramp itself retained very little for casual observers to notice immediately. That is part of why water is such an effective concealment tool. It erases loudness. The most crucial evidence vanishes whole. A body in a room leaves visible disorder. A vehicle in a lake leaves surface calm, yet even hidden crime scenes radiate clues outward through absence and contradiction. Susan was alive and dry enough to function. Her sons were missing. Her story required the existence of a dangerous stranger who had selected her at random and driven away with two small children he supposedly did not know. That already presented an odd behavioral structure. Most carjackers want the car, not the burden of two toddlers strapped in the back seat. A panicked offender might flee with children accidentally still inside, but the longer the story sat in the minds of investigators, the more awkward it began to feel. Why take the vehicle and retain the children? Why not abandon them quickly? Why no ransom call? No second sighting, no witness to a distressed young mother at a light being forced out while a car sped away. These were not yet definitive clues, but they were the first small fractures in the narrative surface. The search became enormous precisely because the case touched two American obsessions at once: endangered children and a vulnerable white mother pleading publicly for help. Media attention accelerated everything. Photographs of Michael and Alex were broadcast everywhere, their little faces bright and trusting in printed images. came to embody national fear. Susan appeared on television, crying, asking for their safe return. Those appearances do not belong only to the public relations side of the case. They are also part of the early clue structure, because they intensified the investigators' need to evaluate not just her words, but her manner. Again, behavioral evidence is dangerous terrain. Grief and shock do not present uniformly. Some people collapse, some detach. Some become repetitive, flat, over-controlled, erratic, too articulate, or strangely calm. But in a case where the physical crime scene was still hidden, her demeanor inevitably became part of what police studied. The challenge was that public sympathy and racialized fear were both working in her favor. The invented black carjacker fit a script the culture was tragically prepared to accept. That meant the absence of evidence against the imaginary suspect did not immediately discredit the story as much as it should have. Instead, suspicion was allowed to hover over an entire category of innocent men while the real clues remained submerged. This is one of the ugliest dimensions of the early crime scene and clue phase. The false accusation created social evidence where no physical evidence existed, drawing investigative attention toward race-based imagination instead of location-based fact. Yet the material world kept resisting the lie. Officers retraced Susan's reported route. They examined the intersection where she claimed the hijacking occurred. They looked for witnesses who might have seen the abduction. They checked the mechanics of her account against the visible environment. Nothing settled neatly into place. The longer investigators worked, the more the story remained oddly unsupported by the outside world. There was also the question of her timeline. In abduction cases, minutes matter, and the exact sequence of when a parent reports, how they travel afterward, and what details they emphasize can reveal whether fear is leading or performance is. Susan's timeline did not comfortably satisfy everyone who heard it. Some officers sensed, before they could prove anything, that something in the shape of the narrative was wrong. That intuition was not enough to solve the case, but it mattered because it prevented the false carjacking story from solidifying into unquestioned truth inside the investigative core. Even as the public rallied around Susan, some investigators were already feeling the first chill of doubt. The actual crime scene beneath the lake carried its own silent clues, though they could not yet be accessed. The car was not merely transportation, it was the murder chamber. Inside it were the boys in their seats, the physical proof that no struggle with a stranger had taken place at some intersection. Once recovered, it would also demonstrate the method, the posture of the bodies, the terrible stillness of how they had died. But before discovery, the car's absence functioned as a clue in reverse. It was the missing center of the whole case. Investigators needed it and did not have it. This made every effort to locate the vehicle urgent. Search grids widened. Bodies of water were considered, bridges, remote roads, wooded areas, reservoirs, ponds, and embankments entered the practical thinking of investigators. In any case involving a missing car, water is always a possibility, but in the Susan Smith investigation, that possibility initially had to compete with the abduction narrative. If authorities were looking for a vehicle driven by a fleeing offender, they would think in terms of routes outward. If they were looking for a concealed vehicle connected to a false report, they would think more in terms of local disposal. The key problem was that the case had not yet decisively shifted from the first model to the second. Still, some of the earliest real clues lay precisely in that tension. Susan's account did not generate the kind of corroboration a true public carjacking should have. The vehicle did not reappear in any way consistent with a hurried abductor. Her emotional presentation, while persuasive on television, did not fully settle investigators' concerns. And the total absence of independent evidence for the suspects she described became harder to ignore over time. The early crime scene also included the police interview room, the place where narratives are tested against themselves. Investigators returned to Susan again and again, asking for repetition, clarification, detail, sequence, Liars often suffer from the burden of invention. Truth is experienced. Lies are maintained. The more often a fabricated story must be retold, the more its unstable joints begin to show. Susan's account shifted in tone and detail enough to draw increasing scrutiny. Not every change was dramatic, but in cumulative form, they mattered. She seemed able to summon grief and urgency. Yet the factual underpinning of what she described remained frustratingly thin. In the beginning, those inconsistencies were not yet a smoking gun. They were one clue among many. And like all behavioral clues, they required caution. But the case was moving toward a crucial realization. The strongest evidence for the abduction was Susan. And the weakest evidence in the whole case was also Susan. Search operations continued under massive public attention. Volunteers and law enforcement looked where lost or abducted children might be found. But every day that passed without confirmation of the carjacker story increased the pressure on the physical facts. No ransom demand, no abandoned vehicle found elsewhere. No sighting that held up under scrutiny, no witness convincingly placing the supposed suspect with Susan at the reported location. This accumulation of nothing was, in its own way, one of the first powerful clues. Real crimes leave messy edges in the outside world. The Susan Smith story seemed to leave almost none. It was too self-contained, too dependent on her testimony. Meanwhile, the hidden real scene remained intact underwater, preserving the truth in a terrible but eventually recoverable form. It is worth pausing on the boys during this phase because crime scenes can make victims disappear twice, first physically and then narratively. Michael and Alex were being searched for as if they were somewhere frightened but alive. In reality, their bodies were already part of a static scene, strapped into their seats. Enclosed in the car, they silently refuted everything their mother was saying. Their very position, once recovered, would become the most devastating clue of all. It would show that this was not the panicked product of a car thief. It was controlled, intimate, and internal, the children themselves. By remaining where Susan had left them, preserved the truth far more faithfully than any adult witness in those first days. They could not speak, but the scene around them eventually would. Another early clue lay in motive, though only as a shadow at first. Investigators began looking into Susan's life, her relationships, her marriage, her emotional state. This is standard, but in a case like hers, it quickly became revealing. The affair with Tom Findlay, her instability, her distress over romantic rejection, her broader unhappiness, all began to suggest that the image of a purely random victim might not fit. Motive is not evidence by itself, but it helps determine whether a story belongs to the world as described. Susan's life contained pressures that made self-generated violence more thinkable than a chance abduction. Especially once her narrative began to weaken. That line of inquiry did not yet expose the truth fully, but it contributed to the growing sense that the real crime scene was not somewhere a stranger had carried her children. It was somewhere Susan herself knew very well. The break between public scene and private scene could not hold forever. Investigators were narrowing emotionally. Even before the decisive evidence emerged, they kept circling back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The story was cleaner than reality usually is, and Susan's suffering, however visible, did not map neatly onto the practical facts. Law enforcement eventually arranged a polygraph examination, a common tactic in cases where direct evidence is scarce, but doubt is hardening. Polygraphs are imperfect and controversial, but their value often lies less in scientific finality than in psychological pressure. By this point, the early clues had formed a pattern. Absent corroboration, shifting narrative, missing car, implausible offender behavior, and a mother who remained both the emotional center of the case and the least independently supported part of it. The crime scene was still underwater, but its gravity was already pulling the investigation toward her. In hindsight, Part 5 feels like a long wrong turn, gradually corrected by reality. The country was looking one way while the truth waited in silence elsewhere. But from the inside, those first days were far more disorienting. Police could not ignore the possibility of live abducted children. The public could not easily surrender the image of the victimized mother. The media kept amplifying the story that Susan herself provided, and beneath all that noise, the physical world remained patient. The lake held the car. The car held the boys held the truth. The first clues were not flashy, they were contradictions, absences, implausibilities, and the growing failure of the invented scene to produce evidence of its own existence. That is often how real investigations begin to pivot. Not with revelation, but with discomfort. Not with certainty, but with the slow erosion of a lie until the only place left to look is the place the liar has been trying hardest to keep in darkness. By the time the first phase of the search was ending, the Susan Smith case had already become infamous in one sense. But its true shape had not yet surfaced. The crime scene and initial clues were teaching investigators something the public was not ready to hear. There had likely been no carjacking. The danger had likely not come from outside. The emotional spectacle on television did not match the hard silence of the evidence. Somewhere nearby, in Stillwater, lay a submerged answer waiting to turn sympathy into horror and turn a missing children case into one of the most infamous acts of maternal murder in American history.